Today I'm thrilled to have three celebrated writers, Susan Choi, Douglas Stuart, and Geoff Dyer, who in their work often reflect on the shaping forces of memory, trauma, and time. Please welcome all three to the stage.
Having found out just about 3 minutes ago that I was going to read for just about 3 minutes, I'm going to read from the very beginning of the book. So I may actually do a little elision in the middle. Louisa and her father are making their way down the breakwater, each careful step on the heaved granite blocks, one step farther from shore. Her mother is not even on the shore, for example, seated, smiling on the sand. Her mother is shut inside the small, almost waterfront house they are renting, most likely in bed. All summer, Louisa has played in the waves by herself because her mother isn't well, and her father is unvaryingly dressed in a jacket and slacks. But tonight, he has finally agreed to walk the breakwater with her. She's asked every day since they first arrived. Spray from the waves sometimes lands on the rocks, and so he has carefully rolled up the cuffs of his slacks. He still wears his hard, polished shoes. In one hand, he holds a flashlight, which is not necessary. In the other hand, he holds Louisa's hand, which is also not necessary. She tolerates this out of kindness. One thing I will always owe your mother is she taught you to swim, because swimming is important to know how to do for your safety. But when she gave you lessons, I thought it was too dangerous. I was very unfair. I hate swimming. They both know the opposite is true. Perhaps her father recognizes her comment for what it partly is, a declaration of loyalty to him, as well as for what it mostly is, a declaration by a 10-year-old child who is contentious by reflex. Far over the water, far beyond where the breakwater joins with a thin spit of sand, the sunset has lost all its warmth and is only a paleness against the horizon. They'll turn back soon. I never learned to swim, her father reveals. I don't believe you, she scoffs. Everybody can swim. Though it's true he always makes a big deal when she wants to get in or even get near the water. It's true. I grew up a poor boy. I had no YMCA. The YMCA is disgusting. I hate going there. Someday you'll feel thankful to your mother, but I want you to act thankful now. These are the last words he ever says to her. Or are they the last words that she can remember? Did he say something more? There is no one to ask. Okay, I'm going to jump forward a teeny bit. Do I have a half a minute left?
You can take a whole minute.
I'm going to jump forward a little more and take 3/4 of a minute to a short time later than the scene that I just read, where this young girl, Louisa, is now back in the United States. She was abroad during that scene with her mother, not her father. And she has been getting into some difficulties at school and has been taken to see someone by her aunt with whom she now lives, now that it's just her and her mother. The appointment had been in a brick office building with a half flight of stairs at the entrance, and as they climbed, her aunt had said, "This is why your mom couldn't come with us, because of these stairs." I called ahead to ask if there were stairs at the entrance, and sure enough, they told me there were. Your poor mama. "She's not sick," Louisa said. "What's that, honey?" Louisa was silent. "I didn't hear you, honey." Now Louisa could pretend she hadn't heard. This was effective. No one was ever listening closely. Even the people who especially claimed to be listening were not really listening. It was this way with the man at the appointment. "My name is Dr. Brickner," he said, making a big show of bending down to shake her hand. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, I changed to the advertised program. I'm going to read a bit about swimming now as well. And maybe, Douglas, do you have a swimming passage? No. Okay, well. My parents could not swim, so they were full of admiration for Mr. Grinnell, a teacher dedicated to make sure that every kid at Naunton Park School acquired this skill at the earliest possible age. Once a week, a battered double-decker bus transported us from school to Alston Baths. These baths bore roughly the same relation to pools at upmarket health clubs that the Victorian workhouse does to a luxury hotel. Alston Baths opened in 1887 and were, by the 1960s, in an advanced state of disrepair. The clangy, heavy chlorinated acoustic amplified this tale of decline, but we did all learn to swim. At a less than uniform pace, we progressed from water-winged doggy paddle to a width and then a length, for which a badge was issued. But the real proof of our increasing aquatic adaptation came in the form of the foot badge known as a verruca. En route from the wet changing rooms to the pool itself, we had to step through disinfectant foot baths intended to prevent the spread of verrucas, but it was difficult to avoid the suspicion that this was where we caught them. They were like little aquariums, those foot baths, invisibly swimming with verrucas. Visible horror on the tiled floors of the changing rooms came in the form of pink band-aids that had floated off raw heels and toes, and water-bloated cigarette ends. Though they were a source of intense pain, it's difficult now not to feel a certain fondness for the verruca as the municipal soul of the welfare state. Back in the changing rooms after our swimming lessons, we had trouble getting our nylon socks back onto our wrinkled, inadequately dried feet. We were in a hurry to get dressed and stuff our wet towels and trunks into our duffel bags because we were all eager to buy the drink from a machine, a hot, sweet, purple-red, slightly frothy, black currant flavoured beverage in a plastic cup that may have been nothing more exotic than hot Ribena. That looked-forward-to drink at the end of the eagerly awaited swimming lesson was itself a prelude to the real highlight of these outings. On the way back to school, the double-decker bus, its roof already dented by the flack of low-hanging branches, had to negotiate a bend at the top of a steep hill. At the moment of maximum precarity, when the bus was tilted over to the left, everyone on the top deck piled into the front left-hand seat in the hope that it would topple over, taking us with it.
I remember that drink. We had hot orange at our swimming baths. Hello, this is from my novel Young Mungo, and it's about two teenage boys who fall in love across a sectarian divide. There will be a word called ducat, and ducat for us is the dovecoats that often unemployed men would build on waste ground or common ground. They had buried James's mother at Lamb Hill on a blowy spring day, when the wind stripped all the blossoms from the trees and the white petals clung to the black mourning cars. After the funeral, his father had spent time helping James build the ducat. The whole thing had been his father's idea. Pigeons were a good, manly pursuit that would teach James discipline and how to care for something smaller than himself. Besides, if they kept busy building something together, then they didn't have to talk about his mother. His father missed 3 work rotations. He stayed away from the rigs as long as he could. He had promised, "Listen, if you spend an hour at the ducat every day, I'll be back in no time at all." Then he packed his rig bag and left James to an empty house and all the tears they could never have shed together. James lay on his bed in a motherless house. The bed sheets were clean, but they smelled sour. His father had left them too long on the clothes pulley, and it had not occurred to him to turn and air them as they dried. It was these small things that made James feel heaviest, small things his mammy would have just known how to do. He had done as his father had advised, and after school he had gone to the Ducat and returned before it was dark. He had played with himself, and then he had fed himself, and then he played with himself some more. Once the fleeting sense of euphoria had ebbed from his body, he was left with the stillness of another empty evening. He turned on the wireless in the kitchen and the television in the living room, and then he lay on his bed and wondered if he was being punished for something. He tried to push away the pictures that came into his mind, but they wouldn't leave. They had started in the new year when the Catholic boys were put out on the north field and played shinty with tartan blue legs. The rain and the wind flayed anyone who would not keep moving in the smur, and they pulled their socks up to try and reach their short hems, but Father Strachan shouted at them to stop making such a pitiful show of themselves. "If you're cold," he yelled above the high collar of his long-sleeved fleece, "then run faster." After battering each other with gammon sticks for 90 minutes, the boys were grateful for the lukewarm showers, water that was barely warm enough to return the feeling to their toes and wash the red clay from their legs. James stood under the end jet. He crammed his blue fingers inside his mouth, and he tried not to look at Paddy Creek with his lazy smile and broad shoulders. He tried not to watch the stream of shampoo as it trickled down his back and ran between his buttocks. But like the stubborn ooze you pick from an acrylic jumper, some unseen static kept pulling his gaze back to the boy, and so James turned away. For he knew if they caught him staring, they would have 100 names for him before he had a name for himself.
Thank you all so much. 3 very different styles and all completely riveting. It's wonderful. Wonderful to have you all on stage. I want to start with actually something that Susan said. Flashlight began as a short story published in The New Yorker in 2020 and subsequently became a novel. And in talking about that, you said, "I wanted to write a novel about these characters from the start. They just couldn't find a way in, which is often a problem for me." Geoff, you famously wanted to write a book about D.H. Lawrence and could not find a way in at all. The book that emerged was Out of Sheer Rage, Wrestling with D.H. Lawrence, and it's really a book about trying to write a book about D.H. Lawrence. I'm very interested in this problem and your various fixes. How do you resolve the struggle, and this is for all of you, to find your way in, as it were? You obviously found your way in. Susan, can we start with you and Flashlight?
Yeah, I just have to say, Out of Sheer Rage is like one of my most inspirational texts, I guess. This idea that you could maybe write about the impossibility of writing about the thing that everyone actually expects you to write about. With this book, so now I encounter the problem that I actually encountered in the writing, which is that there was an event that I wanted to take place in the lives of these characters, and it just seemed so implausible and crazy as a fiction that I wasn't sure it would work. And now I'm dancing around not actually telling you what the event is. But in the writing, I kept thinking oh God, no, if I write that, everybody's gonna be like, no, that would never have happened. So I was really stuck for quite a long time, and I ended up thinking well, why don't I just write about what it's like after the thing happens and just skip the actual thing? And so the second scene that I started reading is actually sort of this leap over, which was just this kind of fearful, lazy writer solution, was I was I'll just skip the actually critical event, and maybe later I'll figure out how to write about it. And that was the way in, actually, and that was the story that was published. But once it was published, then I was now I really have to write the thing.
I would say your idea of lazy is someone else's idea of innovation. I think it's a brilliant trick that you pull off there. But Geoff, how about you? How about with homework? Was it easy to get going?
Well, it was easy in the sense that, I really don't want to boast, but the truth is that I am the world's leading authority on the subject matter of this book. That is to say, myself up to the age of 18. So I was a shoo-in to write it, really. A slight problem is that when I'm reading biographies, the only parts that bore me more than the bits about childhood are the bits about the subject's grandparents. So I was going to go about this in a different way and do it as a kind of map. In Britain, there are these wonderful maps. They're called Ordnance Survey maps, and some cover a county, or they can be much more detailed. And they have a symbol for, say, a post office or a church, and then in the legend down at the bottom, they explain what these are. And I was going to do a spatial rather than temporal version of a memoir, whereby, and instead of the symbol for a church, there'd be a symbol of a fist to show, to indicate a place where I got punched in the face. I want to make it clear, I say punched in the face rather than had a fight, because it was always one-way traffic in that regard. Or, in terms of two-way traffic, there'd be a symbol of, say, a pair of lips, and that would be where I had some sort of romantic encounter. So I liked this idea of doing a verbal map of the very limited area where I grew up, and that's why there's the end papers show a map. But then when it came to it, that caused just too many structural problems, so I ended up going for the most conventional of options, starting at year zero for me, 1958, and then it just keeps trundling along until we get to 1977 when I'm 18. The maths don't quite add up there. But it goes from 0 to 18. Note to self, change for next edition.
How did you score on your maths test at school?
That was my weakest subject. I excelled in everything else, though.
Doug, what was your strongest subject, writing?
Actually, art was my strongest subject. I didn't read books until I was maybe about 17 or 18. I didn't grow up in a house that had any books, and it wasn't so unusual for the time and the place. And then when it was time to go to college or to do something after school, I had wanted to go study English literature, but nobody believed that was a thing a boy from my background could or should do. And so instead I was funneled into textiles. And so when I sat down to start writing my debut novel in 2008, I carried all that sort of low expectations with me, and that sort of high sense of maybe I'm going to fail with this. And so what I actually did was I just wrote what I felt. I didn't impose a structure on the novel. I actually started right in what became the center of the book on chapter 13, and I wrote it, and I wrote the entire novel almost like these vignettes, almost like these little short stories, and there was 34 of them. In fact, there was way more at the very beginning, because the problem with that approach is the first draft of the novel was 1,800 pages. And so, it took me about a year and a half to do it, and I remember sort of having completed this. I was so afraid of losing the inspiration or losing my motivation, or thinking, I'm going to write a book, and then standing back and thinking, how do you write a book? That I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And I remember sort of having these two huge legal binders that were full of this, what would become the novel, and going to my husband and asking him, will you read this? I don't know what it is, will you read it? And he's a good guy, but he kind of went, oh, okay, like that. And he spent about 4 hours in the other room, and then I went in and I went, are you done? And he went, yeah, I'm not done. And it took him about 6 months to read the first draft, and the poor guy, whenever he wanted to watch telly or just stare at a wall for a minute, I'd be like, isn't there something you should be doing? And after about 6 months, he read the manuscript, and for the first, maybe 200 pages, he's incredibly thoughtful with all of his notes. But then, about page 200, the will to live just leaves the man's body, and he just starts to redact the whole thing. And then after about 6 months, when he gives me these 2 huge binders back, I'm so upset that he's done the very thing that I asked him to do, that I don't speak to him for 7 weeks.
Douglas, I want to stay with you a second, because I was really struck by you describing the sort of 34, I think it was 34 vignettes that you sort of broke Shuggie Bain down into. this kind of almost sort of bird-by-bird approach makes writing a novel seem much more manageable to me. And I love it as a trick of a way to sort of persuade yourself that you can get to the finishing line. I want to talk about that with both of you in terms of techniques for seeing a novel through. Like, how do you start with the blank page and get to the end? You did your vignettes. Geoff, what do you do to get to the finishing line of the book? How do you convince yourself it's worth it?
Oh, well, in this particular case, the motivation really was that my parents had both died, and my wife particularly was really insistent that although there's nothing dramatic about my life up to the age of 18, we both felt, she especially strongly, that this was a part of a moment of British social history that was worth preserving. And to go back to that joke I made initially, you know, I was telling my story was a way of telling that larger story, which is a very interesting and important one, I think. And at the risk of saying too much, just to go back to what Douglas was saying, I mean, I too grew up in a house absolutely without books, but unlike you, I mean, after I'd passed the 11 plus, got into grammar school, then the state's educational system sort of passively sort of transported me ultimately to Oxford, and that so it was the state that provided the discovery of books. It was particularly when we did Richard III for O-level, and that wonderful opening up of the world through Shakespearean language.
Well, we could have a whole extra panel on how the British education system destroys lives and opportunities. I'll have that one with Douglas later. Although, look at you all now. You're on stage here in Narrowsburg at the Tustin Theatre. Susan, I'm interested in your technique with Flashlight because, as I mentioned earlier, it emerged from a short story. It started as a short story, which most people would think of as something complete and whole. How do you take a short story and then say, okay, this is actually a novel?
I mean, the thing is that narrative is like a lie that has been perpetrated to make the process seem coherent, but actually the short story emerged from a failed effort to write a novel. So I was trying to write a novel, and I couldn't find my way forward in it at all. I was just kind of going in circles and like generating, piles of material that I guess were mostly each was made coherent by a character. Like, so there'd be like a character, a time period, like a thing that was happening to them, and that would become a pile, and then a different pile. So there are many like heaps of, individually coherent heaps that did not cohere into a whole. And one of those heaps kind of during COVID, of course, when I didn't have anything else to do but, sit around freaking out, I made that into this story. And the truth is that this story was kind of like pulled out of this enormous incoherent mass. And so when I tried to like continue with the incoherent mass, one of the things that was sort of striking about what you said, Douglas, about your vignettes is that I think I was also kind of not generating vignettes exactly, but generating this material that, some of it centered on like the daughter in this family when she's a teenager, or the mother when she's younger before the daughter's born, or like just all of this stuff. There was so much stuff that I started thinking like, oh, maybe it's a novel after all, and I had a binder too. And I like every once in a while to like really cheer myself up, I would print everything out, and then I would spend like hours hole punching it instead of printing on. It was very satisfying. Instead of using the pre-punched paper, then you have to punch yourself, and also very inefficient hole puncher that only will take like literally 7 to 8 sheets, like not even 10, because if you do 10, those metal thingies, they can't do it. So I'd spend a whole day punching, collating, and put it into a binder, and then I had no one to foist it onto. But anyway, eventually I had this amazing idea that I would put all of the different episodes into chronological order, which had never occurred to me. And actually, that was kind of the beginning of recognizing a novel, because I think I had this idea that it would be very, like, interesting, and so chronology seemed like the last thing you would want to do. But it turns out to really come in handy, even in a fictional context.
I want to stay with this thought, Susan, because you've also talked about, and it's a metaphor I really love, weeding stuff out from early drafts as a way to kind of amplify what remains. And this is for all of you, but I would love one vivid detail that you excavated versus one you pruned to transform the emotional kind of weight or gravity of your work.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
So my novel centers on a family, this Louisa and her parents. And I did not, as I mentioned, with the chronology thing, I didn't understand what the scope of the novel would be for a long time. And when I put everything that I had in chronological order, I was shocked by the scope. I was like, oh shit, sorry. The novel had much more scope than I had intended. And when you get a lot of scope, suddenly there seem to be things missing, right? Because I was like, I'm just gonna write a really slim novel. But then when it turns out to be like a sprawling thing that spans like over 30 years, then you start noticing like enormous holes. And I'd really wanted, it was meant to be actually, after it was a story, I had meant it to be kind of novella length, was my actual plan. It's the longest book I've ever published. It was meant to be about 150 pages. So I guess the detail I excavated, my agent was the person I foisted it on, and she said, we never really see Louisa ever outside like the shadow of her parents. We like never really see her doing something outside the reference of her family. And I ended up writing this section about her young adulthood. And I was like, oh, this was missing. And then on the flip side, there was an entire huge section from the point of view of a sister of one of the main characters who sort of is providing like this alternate viewpoint on the events, and just gone completely. Like that was a whole chapter that we just ditched because it felt redundant.
In my case, I mean, there wasn't pruning so much as a failure to follow advice to prune. So my American editor felt there was too much stuff early on about me and my toys, because the early part of the book is this phrase Billy Collins uses. It's a catalogue raisonné of all the toys I had. And he said I should cut that and get on to the relationships with other people, uncles and aunts. But I rarely follow the advice of editors because I just don't. And also, my point there was that, well, he didn't understand, because he had brothers and sisters, that if you're an only child, then your relations actually are with your toys. And then later on, that void that's left by growing out of toys, because I'm not one of those weird people who at 16 still wants to play with toy soldiers or something, then, reading whooshed into the vacuum left by that. Otherwise, in terms of excavating, I didn't need to, that was a weird mixture of metaphors there, by the way, Aaron, pruning and excavating.
I will hire you as my editor.
I didn't need to excavate. I was always very faithful to just these random, unimportant moments that just lodged for reasons that I still can't understand very vividly in my consciousness. These are sort of my equivalents of those what Wordsworth called spots of time, but whereas Wordsworth goes into a long explanation of what spots of time are, these spots that are so vivid, I still don't know why they, rather than other moments, have become so important to me, but I had an unquestioning fidelity just to their tenacity, really.
Douglas.
Yeah, I learned a lesson after 10 years of battling with Shuggie Bain, and that was, for my next book, I better have a plan. And so I went into young Mungo And I plotted out the 25 or so chapters thinking I knew what I was going to write about. It's a novel about two young men who fall in love across a sectarian divide. But one of the young men, Mungo, is sent to the north of Scotland. There's something like 40,000 lochs in the north of Scotland. And he's sent to the north with two friends of his mother's in order to get him out of the dangers of the city, but also to make him a man out of him through, camping and hunting and fishing. And I was writing from a place of anger. I wanted to write a book about how vulnerable young men were and how I had grown up in a time where it was believed that boys around any men was always a good idea. Like, no matter who it was, if you could... And the idea came to me, actually. I was at... two things had happened. I was in my late 30s, and I was at a dinner party with friends in London. And they'd, I was of the age where all my friends now had kids. And we were talking about our childhoods, and I recalled a story when I was 11 years old, where my mother sent me away for a long weekend with two men who were both called Jim, and she didn't know their second names. And she had sent me to the north of Scotland because it was a good thing. I would get fresh air, I would fish. She was a single mother. She didn't know how to teach me how to be a man, as she felt. And I remember these middle-class friends and the horror on their faces, and I thought, oh, we don't do that anymore, do we? And they didn't, they really sort of the fear on their faces. And so I wanted to write this novel about this boy that goes into the wilderness with these men. But I thought it was a book about the silence of trauma. When men suffer trauma, we're taught not to share it with anyone else because it further emasculates us. And I thought my character would come back from this long weekend and just sort of sit on it and let it eat him into his adult life. But I had my plan laid out, and I got so angry about halfway through writing the novel. I got so angry at the characters that the entire plan went out the window. And I just hadn't accounted for how I would also be changed by the story of a book.
I have to say that part of young Mungo is so dark.
Yeah.
And thrilling as well. It's just such as a page turner in a literary novel. A lot of literary novels are page turners, of course. Let's stay with memory, because we hear a lot about memory's unreliability, but each of you harness its flaws as kind of creative material, which I find really interesting. So Douglas, you've said your Glasgow memories live in the senses, the smells, the textures, the damp. It's all I have, is your quote. Geoff, in writing Homework, you noted, "It is possible that the way I remember these things says more about me now than about how things were then." And Susan, your novel Flashlight emerged not from precise recollections of Japan, for example, but from hazy, fragmentary impressions, is the quote. So I wonder if you think that uncertainty around memory is a strength when it comes to writing, and then how you turn that kind of uncertainty into a kind of aesthetic. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, I love the story you just told, because I think one of the things, I've never managed to stick, even if I've had a plan, which I usually don't, even if I do have a vague plan, I've never stuck to it. And I think one of the things that has made writing, it takes a long time to write a book, right? I don't know about you, you're very prolific, so maybe you're faster, but it takes me like 5 years or more. And I think one of the reasons that I ever finish is because I don't know what the book is, actually, and that's very confusing and disturbing, but also it's kind of engaging and exciting to be floundering along going I don't know what this is going to consist of. And so I do think writing from a place of not knowing, that's why I love Out of Sheer Rage so much, not even knowing how you're ever going to start, not remembering the thing that you're trying to remember, all that uncertainty, I find very, very generative, I guess. And this book is really, it's fiction, but it was precipitated by these memories that I had of a childhood, 6 to 8 month period of time that I lived in Japan with my parents. The events that befall these folks happily did not befall us, but it was a very weird experience for me. It was the late 70s, Japan was a very different place. I'd never been out of the country, and I had these memories that were dark and sort of, there was something very almost gothic about my remembered Japan. And I wrote the book very much without the intention of ever setting foot in Japan until the book was totally done. And then I had this opportunity to go to Japan unrelated to the book when I was still revising, and I was like, ooh, should I do it? And I couldn't resist, so I went. And I went to the town that I had lived in as a child. So in this book, Louisa and her parents live in this apartment building that's based on my recollections of where we lived in Japan. It sounds like Scotland, actually. It's dark, it's wet, it's dank, there's smells. It's like the sun has never shone inside this building. When I went to this town, it turned out the building was still there. And my hosts took me to the very address where I had lived and took me inside to this sun-drenched space with windows everywhere. And I was like, has the building been renovated? And everyone's like, no. So that was so weird. But I think like I wouldn't have written this book if I had disrupted like those totally distorted memories.
Yeah, I guess if you're writing a memoir, then the book is inherently about memory. Obviously, it's different to writing a sort of biography. And, one of the reasons I think that there's a tendency, this is for somebody of my generation, to remember one's childhood as being perpetually sunny, is because of the photographs. And back then, of course, people of a certain age in the audience will remember that you only took photographs on sunny days because, partly if your dad was as cheap as mine was, you didn't want to squander money on film, and also because, it was just, you just didn't bother with that. And then memory is itself kind of unreliable. I'll just tell one very, very short anecdote that there's this scene in the book where my mum's sister, who had a very, very different life to my mum, she ended up with this self-made millionaire who lived in London, and they came to visit us, and they turned up at our terraced house in this white Rolls Royce this would be in about 1966. And as many of you will know, that's a classic scene from the 1960s films, which is a great era of sort of social mobility. Anyway, so I write this, and then just last week, my aunt sent me a note saying it wasn't a white Rolls Royce, it was yellow. And I said, no, it was white. And then, like one of those horrible fact checkers at the New Yorker, she then sent a picture of this yellow Rolls Royce. So, this is the nice thing about book writing in a way. If I had been writing for the New Yorker, I would have been obliged to change white to yellow. But even in the face of this conclusive evidence in a criminal trial, I would have been, okay. But the truth, my truth, which I will go to my grave believing, is that it was white.
Douglas.
Yeah, I mean, not to bring it down, but that's kind of my place in the literary canon, I think, bring everything down. But, I wrote Shuggie Bain. I started it at 32, and I wrote it because I'd lost my mother to addiction. My mother had suffered with alcoholism my entire life from before I was born, and then eventually, very slowly, she kills herself when I'm 16. And so I go on and I move through life, and I find myself in my 30s. I still cannot get over this grief because there was nowhere for it to go. And so memory for me became really tricky because I owned this story, but also my siblings owned it. And what I came to learn, and also the community owned it, because part of the backdrop for the sense of hopelessness in Glasgow is Glasgow it's a problematic term, but it was known as the second city of the empire because it was massive, it was booming, it was very wealthy. And then at the end of the 20th century, starting about the 1950s, it declines very rapidly. And then Thatcher closes all industry within 2 decades, everything. And unemployment in the city goes to about 28% and stays there for my entire childhood. And so everything dissolves, the first thing being men and women can't keep their promises to each other. And so children, are raised in single family homes, all of this. But I realized that even within my family, my sister had a great childhood because she's 16 years older than me. And so she had parents that were wonderful, she had lived in a city that was booming, and then I had such a different thing. And so I cheated a little bit by allowing it not to be a memoir and roping in lots of other characters to tell the story. Also because it was an incredibly difficult time, and it was owned by men often. You know, I write into a literary tradition that's well mined. You know, you think about Alistair Gray or Irvine Welsh or James Kelman, who won the first Scottish Booker. But it's covered, but it's always covered from a very patriarchal, straight male point of view. Yet my entire memory was feminine because I was the son of a single mother. We didn't have a man at home in a working class place that was defined by what men did for jobs. My mother was an alcoholic, which meant I was part of a subculture that was all of these other women who were also drinking and hiding their drinking. And you know, memory was both a sort of a very personal, very skewed thing for me, but it was also a really wonderful thing. You know, the wonderful thing about alcoholism, it's not a wonderful thing, but one of the things is, it's wonderful in hindsight because, you know, I would be in this room with like 8 housewives in the middle of the day who were drunk, and I would be 7 years old. And it was a way for me, because I didn't get to know my mother as an adult, I got to see her at least here as an adult, because alcohol takes away all defenses and it's a huge leveler. And so instead of her son, I was just another pal. I was just another friend in the room. I was a witness. And I remember the most graphic conversations about love and about sex. My favorite line I ever heard was, I think, there was a woman called Ginty, and she said to my mother, and I was 7, she said, "He has a massive dick, but he doesn't like to kiss." And like, she was talking about one of her boyfriends, and I just remember sort of taking the shortbread round the room, and I didn't know at the time, but I was like, oh, I have to write a book about this, you know, when I get to be an adult, you know, sort of both horrified by the debauchery in the room, and then also thinking, I'm a young man, a witness to this closed world that I should never have seen, and you know, and what a memory I had given to me that I wanted to share it.
This is wonderful. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's going to have to wrap soon, but I have a few more questions. You're all, let's talk about place, since you brought it up with Glasgow so much, but you're all from quite different places. Susan, you were born in South Bend, Indiana. Doug, you grew up in Glasgow. Geoff, you really just published a complete elegy to Cheltenham in one way or another, Cheltenham, England. Your working class childhood in a very middle class town. What's one thing we should know about each of these places, and how do you think growing up there shaped your sense of self?
I love the way you have to go first, Susan.
One thing you should know about South Bend, Indiana is, if you don't know this already, and you might, is that it's the home of the University of Notre Dame, which is the most powerful and most Catholic of the Catholic universities in this country and possibly in the world. So it's a huge center of Catholic life internationally and definitely nationally, maybe like the center of United States Catholic life. And because the university is extraordinarily wealthy, it has the power and the funds to suck people from all over the world who are not Catholic, as well as Catholics, to this place, South Bend. That's the reason that Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court is from South Bend. Pete Buttigieg is from South Bend. I'm from South Bend. So it's not a coincidence. All of us are from families that were affiliated with Notre Dame one time or another. So that's a notable aspect of that place.
Geoff?
I guess I can't come up with an endorsement for the town without confining it to a particular. The place is sort of synonymous to me also with a particular time. That period from the time I was born up till I get a place at university, which then roughly coincides with the end of that period, extending from the end of the Second World War, when there's the setting up of the welfare state, of which I'm just so entirely a beneficiary. And then, as Douglas was saying, that really comes to an end, that period, which in sort of British history is known as the sort of New Jerusalem, you know, this sort of vision of a nation with opportunities for everybody. And then that of course, I mean, that sort of undermines itself in a way, but it comes absolutely to an end with the election that sees Margaret Thatcher introducing this a very different economy, the one that we sort of imported from America and we live in now. But there was a time, this wonderful time, where in addition to completely free healthcare, which we still have, I love rubbing Americans' noses in that fact, and also completely free, wonderful state education. And that was all wonderful, but the best thing of all is that after leaving Oxford, I was full of ambition, and I knew exactly, unlike some people who didn't know what they wanted to do, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to sign on the dole and claim benefits. And that was great too.
I mean, I think it's fair to argue that I will never get a job on the Glasgow Tourist Board. But I would recommend that everybody goes to Glasgow, because I think you wouldn't, you cannot go to a place where you'd be more embraced, you'd be more welcomed, you would have a better time. It is really a miraculous city. And I'm often asked in my work about how very wild things can live together. You know, in great sadness, there can be a lot of humor. In humor, there's sadness, and you know, in tenderness, there's violence. And I can't claim to have invented that. That is part of the nature of the people of the city. You know, they are all in it together, and they look out for one another. They hate artificiality. They hate things that feel fake or too well-mannered. But it often means that life sort of comes at you, and you have to just deal with it as it comes. And I always love the saying that they have, you know, we're about 30 miles away from Edinburgh. Everybody knows Edinburgh. Edinburgh's like the beautiful, well-heeled, well-educated city. Everybody loves Edinburgh. She's easy to love. And Glasgow's like 30 miles to the west of it. But there's a saying in Scotland that says you'll always have a better time at a Glaswegian funeral than you ever will at an Edinburgh wedding. And like, and it's honestly true. And that sums up what you need to know about Glasgow.
So we're on a kind of witty roll now. So I'm gonna start with Geoff on this one to give both of you time to think about your answer. But Geoff, in The Last Days of Roger Federer, which is a great title, and we have copies down here. That's your most recent essay collection. You have this wonderful and frankly very reassuring section on all the books you failed to finish reading. I'd like to quote, if I may, briefly from that section. "I've given up more than once on The Man Without Qualities, Proust, 1 volume out of 7, twice. The Brothers Karamazov, I've just checked. A 2012 receipt from a restaurant in Bologna was preserved between pages 80 and 81. Thought I'd done better. The Ambassadors, gripped each time by the conviction, at once blurry and insistent, that my reading glasses were somehow changing prescription mid-sentence. And the kicker, and most of Faulkner." So, for each of you, we'll start with you, Geoff. You have to come up with a new one. Which book have you tried and failed to get through?
Well, God, I'm rather disadvantaged since you've listed all the best ones. There's another I mention in the book. I mean, Anthony Powell's. Anthony Powell apparently was such an incredible snob that when his pipes were burst, the plumber came round to fix them. And the plumber said, "I'm here for Anthony Powell." And Powell said, "No one of that name lives here." So he would. So anyway, that says something quite profound about England. So that 12-volume sequence of his, A Dance to the Music of Time, I got up to volume 5, which meant I gave it about 600 pages worth of patience, was absolutely convinced it was devoid of value, and I stopped there. And then, of course, my father-in-law said, "Oh, it really gets going with volume 6. But no, that was, you know.
Who wants to jump in next? Susan?
I mean, Geoff's whole list. I would add The Golden Bowl to it. Never, and I actually have receipts, many, many receipts stuck into The Golden Bowl, the same copy that I've had since college that's about to fall apart. Proust, have failed the first volume multiple times and multiple translations, actually. I think 3 different translations. And the thing about Proust is that I'm convinced that spiritually Proust should be my favorite author. But I become so exhausted by the beauty of the sentences that I just can't go on. I'm like the Hawthorns. It's so beautiful. It's like unbearable. And so I'll add one of also Dance to the Music of Time. Never even got through the first volume. So I never even got close to 5. Gravity's Rainbow.
Ditto.
And oh no, I don't want to say it here. May he rest in peace. I won't name it. But yeah, Gravity's Rainbow can't do it. But the thing about the frying of the bananas at the beginning, I've read it so many times. It's wonderful. I read it like 20 different times.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a list or things that I've sort of failed at because I think I'm still reading my way through the world. But I think because I write about poverty, people in the UK instantly, critics who are generally middle class, instantly say, it's very Dickensian, it's very Dickensian. And the truth is I've never read Dickens. And I'm the only British person that I know, Geoff, exactly. But you're sort of like, you're like dunked in it as a kid. It's on the television every Saturday. And so, you know, you've absorbed it in other ways and you've got it. But I also grew up when the queer canon was always very middle class or upper middle class. And I've found myself now as an adult with choice that I never, if I pick up a book and it's a queer story and it starts in either the army or a boarding school or in some kind of stately home, I just can't get past the first page, so I close it and I just put it aside. And I think that's not for me.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a treat.
Thank you.